Welcome to the Sourcing Industry Landscape Podcast, powered by SIG.org and hosted by Dawn Tura.
Well, folks, welcome back to the podcast series. I am so excited because I have an opportunity to introduce you to one of our keynotes. He's actually our closing keynote at the upcoming summit. And the summit is at the Omni Rancho Las Palmas Resort in Rancho Mirage, Palm Desert, which is part of Palm Springs area of California. So I am excited. So I have with me today, John Sidolides. He's a principal at Trilogy Advisors, LLC in Washington, specializing in U.S. government relations, geopolitical risk, and international affairs. He's also National Security Senior Fellow at the Foreign Research Institute. And let me tell you, his resume goes on and on and on, but he delivers exclusive geopolitical risk reports, webcasts, and related products and services to institutional capital markets and retail clients. He's a professional speaker at corporate, investor, and industry events such as ours. He's also testified before Congress. He's a frequent national commentator on U.S. international media such as Bloomberg News, CNN, Fox News, CNN International, and News Nation. He's been interviewed or cited in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and Washington Times, the National Interest, Political, National Public Radio, Asia Times, Institutional Investor, South China Morning Post, and other leading print and digital medias. His domestic client portfolio includes industry leaders in real estate, home construction, agribusiness, along with aviation and emerging technologies, with a specialization in environmental regulatory reform and private property rights protection. He's also a member of the Association of International Risk Professionals, the Intelligence and National Security Alliance, the Columbia University Club of Washington, D.C., the Empire State Forum, and the Association of Former Senator Aides. Now, John also holds a master's degree in international and public affairs from Columbia University. His wife is an attorney and a businesswoman, and they have 4 college-age sons. So, John, wow. And I am skipping over a bunch of your resume, and that is so impressive.
Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate the very kind introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be with you and your audience here today.
Well, I'm so excited to have you. But before we get started, we're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. And when we return, we're going to hear from our guest.
Sourcing Industry Group, or SIG, is the premier global sourcing association and is widely known as a forum for providing thought leadership, networking, and training opportunities. Another central element of SIG is training. SIG is the parent organization for SIG University, which was founded on the ideals of elevating sourcing and risk professionals to deliver strategic value to their organizations and transform their careers. It was created at the request of SIG members who saw an educational training gap for today's workforce and offers one-of-a-kind certification and training programs for professionals seeking deep expertise in sourcing, governance, risk, intelligent automation, and more for themselves and for their teams. We perfected e-learning for adults before it was necessary. Our proven model for adult learners provides a flexible environment with online lessons, quizzes, and discussion forums moderated by expert faculty. Programs are offered in several different delivery models depending on you or your organization's need. Open cohort semesters start on average every 1.5 months, while closed cohorts for teams of 20 or more can start at any time. In addition, we also have self-paced or fast-track options. You can learn more about all of these offerings on the SIG website or by reaching out to one of our representatives. So make sure to take advantage of all that SIG has to offer for both members and non-members alike, because there really is something for everyone.
So, John, without giving away your entire keynote conversation, I just want to dive into a few things that will sort of maybe scintillate people and say, hey, I really need to be there to see John speak in person. So I'd love to start with, how do potential geopolitical risks impact global supply chains and strategic procurement planning in your perspective?
Yeah, great question there, Dawn. First of all, geopolitics has become, I think, an often and sometimes improperly used term to denote the so-called complexity of international relations. What geopolitics really means is pretty straightforward. It's the impact of immutable geographic qualities and conditions on international political decisions. There's a reason that China views the Asian continent the way that it does based on its geography and the geographic conditions of its neighbors. The same thing with India in South Asia. The same thing with Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is a confessional contest, but also one involving geography, history, and territory in the Middle East. And clearly, one of the most pronounced geopolitical contests of recent history is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the way it views Ukraine not only as a cultural and historical and, for that matter, bloodkin, but because Russia views Ukraine as a soft underbelly from which NATO could potentially threaten Moscow in ways that would not be the case otherwise. So when we talk about geopolitics, it's very important to look at how it applies to the world and security conditions through that specific prism. So when we talk about supply chains, for instance, we know how disruptive to global supply chains we had as the result, not so much of, say, the COVID pandemic, I would say, Dawn, but government decisions to lock down their economies and their societies.
Correct.
The virus itself had zero impact on supply chains. It was political decisions to do so. And much of that, of course, is macroeconomic and public finance and not so much geopolitical. But what we have now really emerging and accelerating, I think, as a result of the lockdowns and the recovery from the lockdowns, is a much more aggressive China that is threatening international waterways and free and open shipping lanes through the South China Sea in ways that could lead to potential conflict with Taiwan, which, if it were to be successfully annexed or conquered by China, would severely disrupt the flow of the world's most advanced semiconductors from Taiwan to the United States and to every advanced industrial country in the world. If you have a conflict between China and the Philippines over the South China Sea and their contest over a series of rocks and shoals and reefs, you could have a threat to free and open shipping and waterways in other parts of the world, such as in the Mediterranean, where you have a number of countries that are also contesting each other's continental shelves and exclusive economic zones. And free and open shipping, again, in the context of geopolitics and supply chain management, is absolutely essential to the world economy as we've known it for the last 30 years, really since the end of the Cold War. And these shipping lanes are predicated on the ability of the U.S. Navy working with our allies and partners in Asia, in Europe, in the Indian Ocean, around the African continent, and certainly closer to home here in the U.S., in the Caribbean, and around Latin America. Not only does the United States benefit and our allies benefit, but ironically, even our foes and adversaries and outright enemies benefit from this globalized economy that is so dependent on fragile supply lines, as we learned from the COVID lockdowns, but also disruptions such as what happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and disruptions in terms of foodstuffs, fertilizers, essential energy supplies. The concern we have now about a possible enlargement of the war in the Middle East, Israel going beyond the attacks against Hamas in retaliation for the brutal October 7th massacres of Israeli citizens last year, and now having to deal with constant rockets coming in from Hezbollah to the north of Israel. But if Israel attacks Hezbollah to eliminate that threat, there's a possibility of Iran retaliating on behalf of its proxies. And then you have the possibility of a wider war that could affect the very, very valuable and fragile supply chains of oil and natural gas out of the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. Not so much to the American economy. We're much more resilient because of our robust energy production here in the U.S., but our allies in Asia and in Europe.
Yeah.
And then we also have the possibility to look at, for instance, what the Houthis have done with shipping in the Red Sea, where you've had a near collapse of shipping lane passage in the Red Sea connecting Asia and the Indian Ocean and the Middle East to European markets and vice versa. And so we have this so-called ragtag bunch of rebels, armed, financed, and organized by Iran, that have effectively shut down one of the world's most sensitive supply chains through the Red Sea and through the Bab al-Mandab Strait in the south part of the Red Sea and the Suez Canal in the north. And this is without even going into how dependent the global economy is, Dawn, on not only energy and foodstuffs and fertilizers, but also raw materials that are required to produce steel and plastics and ceramics and glass and all of the essentials of modern advanced industrial civilization. So we have a very, very fragile situation that we didn't see as recently as 7 or 8 years ago. But I would say that really with the rise of Xi Jinping coming to power as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012, and Vladimir Putin taking on a much more revanchist, resurgent, aggressive posture in Europe. And then the supreme leader of Iran, much more buoyed and self-confident by this Chinese and Russian belligerence against American partners. And now even, I would say, the fourth segment of this is North Korea, saber rattling against Japan and South Korea, all very much cause for concern in terms of the geopolitical shocks to supply chains and to procurement planning around the world.
Absolutely. And, once we went global, there's no way to put that back in a bottle. So as much talk as there is around nationalism and bringing all of our supply chains home, we can't. Once you've gone global, you can't go and put it all back away and unpack it and say, we're not going to do that anymore. So it's going to be continuing to be a very interesting dynamic for supply chain planning. But also, can we talk a little bit about the energy markets? You touched on it lightly. What are the forces that impede global energy markets from adapting to government net zero mandates in the next few decades, in your mind as well?
To encapsulate this as concisely as I can, primarily I would say it's the laws of physics and the laws of economics. That what we've had is a number of political leaders, mostly in Western countries, that have adopted an ideological attachment to transitioning away from fossil fuels to net zero carbon emissions, which probably will take place in the decades ahead. But the laws of physics and the laws of economics don't care about politicians' objectives or rhetorical statements or campaign promises. Mm-hmm. The transition will take place as physics, economics, and market forces will allow. So I think 2035 is an utterly absurd target for any political leader to ascribe to. Mm-hmm. And you see what's happened, for instance, to the German economy, where they've made very, very unwise decisions, moving away from hydrocarbons after becoming completely dependent on Russia, of course, a hostile authoritarian regime for oil and for natural gas, foregoing nuclear, closing down their 6 nuclear plants, and thinking that they can basically power their very, very highly advanced industrial economy with wind and solar, again, geopolitics, in a region of Europe where the wind often does not blow and the sun often does not shine. And so Germany has actually had to go backwards. They've regressed, Dawn, and they are now tearing apart an entire town to dig into the lignite coal, the dirtiest, most heavily polluting form of coal, in order to be able to provide base load to back up wind and solar when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. So Germany is one example of how, again, artificial utopian objectives do not work with the laws of physics and economics. I would also add that even here in the US, we've had very significant investments in recent years through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically a climate policy bill, and even the CHIPS Act and the like, to try to reshore supply chains and to bring about greener energy here in the United States. But there is significant permitting delays. You have to build new transmission lines across the United States. And many people who favor a rapid transition or an accelerated transition to net zero don't want transmission lines in their neighborhoods. And so we're going to have to build thousands and thousands of miles of new transmission lines to connect wind and solar to major urban areas. And that's going to be very, very difficult. And you've also had a very slow rollout simply because of the way the federal bureaucracy works. It is not a very responsive bureaucracy here in the US. But I would say really on a global scale, Dawn, when we're talking about a transition from any form of energy to another, there are probably two things here. One, we really have never seen a transition in historical terms over the last 200 plus years that we've had the movement around the world from a largely agricultural poor series of economies worldwide to advanced industrial and now technologically based economies. What we've had more or less is energy additions, energy supplements. So when you had, for instance, coal coming to market at a scalable and affordable rate, it did not move poorer societies away from biomass. They still use wood chips and animal dung in many parts of the world, the poorest parts of the world. Mm-hmm. But coal overlaid that use of energy. And then when oil was available at a scalable and affordable level, Oil supplemented coal. Then we have natural gas supplementing oil and coal. Then we have nuclear supplementing gas and oil and coal. And now we have a series of renewable energy technologies that are supplementing hydrocarbons. But if anyone looks at the historical record just of the last 15, 20 years, the use of hydrocarbons has actually accelerated faster than the use of renewables on a global scale. So what's happening is that much of the world is becoming richer, more affluent, which is a good thing. But those societies that are developing their economies are not going to go from wood chips to wind turbines. They're going to go through all the stages. And right now, the most affordable one of these hydrocarbons is coal. And then when they become richer, they can move to oil, and then they can go to gas, and then they might go to nuclear, or they might go to wind and solar. But those are decisions those national leaders will make based on the well-being of their societies, and they care very little for the pronouncements of Western officials about 2035 and 2050. And, it's not a coincidence, Don, that these target years always end in a 5 or a 0, right? No one ever talks about net zero 2043 or 2061 because they're nice political sound bites, but they're completely divorced from the reality of physics and from economics. And going back to the point that I made earlier about the supply chains regarding materials needed to progress our advanced industrial civilization, you need steel and cement and plastics and glass and ceramics and fertilizer. If we don't have fertilizer that is based on natural gas, 1/3 of the world will starve to death in about 6 months. These all require hydrocarbons. So for better or for worse, this is kind of an amoral issue. It's simply the complexity of the existing global energy infrastructure that is based on billions of inputs from citizens all around the world, companies all around the world, and really the ability of energy forms that are energy dense so they can provide the maximum energy exajoule power, per dollar or per euro or per yen. And in order to be able to deliver that to people around the world who need energy, not only to survive, but to thrive and to flourish. And anyone who I think is ideologically committed to net zero targets without realizing that there are maybe 1 to 2 billion people who are getting by on $2.50 or $5 a day, those people need to have access to the kind of quality of living that we in the West are blessed to enjoy. Otherwise, we'd be condemning 1/4 of the world's population to continued destitution and poverty and survivalist lifestyles. And I think that is very immoral compared to many of the arguments that we hear about global energy markets.
That's fantastic. So, not fantastic, but it's interesting the way you said it. So what you're saying, though, is that we're layering additional types of energy sources on top of one another rather than retiring the ones below them. Is that true?
There is no historical precedent in the last 200 years of mankind retiring any scalable, affordable, reliable form of energy. And as a matter of fact, I think, to the degree that almost all of us want a cleaner environment and always having cleaner air and cleaner water to the extent that it is economically feasible, I think ultimately there's going to be a very significant move towards nuclear power.
Yes.
As it becomes more safe, more reliable, more affordable, hopefully more permittable by various countries. But I think if you're looking at genuinely carbon-free solutions to growing energy demand, and we haven't even touched on what's going to be happening with soaring, skyrocketing electricity demand,
I was just going to
from the growth in AI, in data servers, and electric vehicles. And so energy demand will continue to grow at a significant rate for the foreseeable future. Let's just say now for 25 years. But you can't power all of this additional energy demand on top of existing sizable energy demand with wind and solar. There simply isn't enough. There aren't enough materials. Mm-hmm. There aren't enough workers to be able to implement this. And one other part that I'll close on this question with this, just as I started this answer, Dawn, with Germany's very unwise decision to make its economy utterly dependent on a hostile authoritarian Russia for oil and natural gas, is it really wise for the United States and the West to become dependent on the Chinese Communist Party's largesse and generosity, since they control the overwhelming abundance of solar panel and wind turbine production, as well as the processing of rare earth elements that are fundamental to the advanced technological industrial base that makes life so spectacular in the West. So we really have to think hard about reshoring, reglobalizing, rethinking the way supply chains and strategic procurement decisions are made, not just for economic efficiency purposes, but really what kind of a world do we want to live in 2040, 2050, and beyond?
Wow. You have so much knowledge. It's just incredible. If we have, I just want to ask one more question, because as we record this, there's increased pressure on Ukraine to negotiate a ceasefire with Russia. And the biggest issue right there is Ukraine wants to be invited to join the NATO alliance. Can you talk about the ramifications of if it is or is not invited? And do you think that's going to affect the ceasefire?
It's one of the most difficult aspects of what has been a horrific situation in the heart of Europe. And I think decent people around the world feel terribly for the suffering of the Ukrainian people at the hands of the Russian military. But I think if we look back, Dawn, honestly, we see that there were terrible mistakes made on all sides here. And, there was this quote unquote Istanbul agreement in March or April of 2022 that could have brought about a very quick end to the war, to the invasion of Ukraine. And Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, probably with the backing of President Biden, I think they thought that they could strategically weaken the Russian army by providing arms, ammunition, and equipment and support to Ukraine to try to sort of open up a vulnerable hole along Russia's border with Ukraine. The problem is that that should have been a much shorter war, and it should have come to a close more quickly. We are now deep into the third year, and there may not be an end in sight. And I think also it's not just a matter of who wins the presidential election in November. I think President Trump, in his usual hyperbolic fashion, has said he can solve the war, bring about a ceasefire in a day. I don't think anyone takes him literally, but I think he would want to negotiate. He's been very open about this, a ceasefire. And I think even if President Kamala Harris were to continue the Biden administration's policies of seeking to arm Ukraine, I think much of the steam, much of the energy on Capitol Hill is running out because so many Americans are wondering, where is the federal support for many of the problems that we have in the United States with our infrastructure, with our open border, with a whole host of problems that we need to address here in the United States, that we want to be as supportive of Ukraine as possible, but we can't afford $60 to $100 billion every year, which is more actually than the United States, based on inflation over the last 80 years, provided for the reconstruction of Europe with the Marshall Plan after its complete destruction by the Nazis in World War II. So Ukraine has already benefited more than all of Europe did after the Nazis were defeated. So I think you have a number of factors at play here, but here's the problem. President Zelensky has made very clear that he will not accept a ceasefire that allows Russia to retain territory in eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. The problem is that Ukraine does not have the military wherewithal to be able to move those forces out. And I think they're also recognizing that time is running out in terms of European and American support indefinitely. But I don't believe that NATO will provide an invitation to Ukraine anytime soon, because that really was the red flag or the tripwire, one might say, for Putin invading Ukraine. As a matter of fact, as he was warning throughout 2021 to the NATO alliance to not open an invitation to Ukraine, I think it was about a month and a half or 2 months before the invasion in late December, that the US government was still maintaining that Ukraine would be invited to join the NATO alliance. I think what you'll see in a ceasefire instead, Don, is maybe sort of a package that allows for Ukraine to potentially join the European Union so it can redevelop its economy and grow an economy that will likely cost about $500 billion and maybe 30 to 40 years to rebuild, such as the devastation that the Russian military has wreaked across eastern Ukraine. You may also have Ukraine become what's known as a non-NATO major ally, like Israel, a number of countries in the Middle East and in Asia, so that it's not a formal member of the NATO alliance, but it does receive a significant amount of American military support and training and the like to deter Putin or a Putin successor from invading Ukraine again and restarting a war in the heart of Europe in 2028, 2030, or 2035. But I think most of all, you'll see most of the parties coming together to say, how do we bring this a ceasefire about? Unfortunately for Ukraine, this will likely remain a frozen conflict for the foreseeable future. And that's just a consequence, again, of the geopolitics of the Russia-Ukraine issue.
Wow. I mean, we could go country by country around the world, and I have questions for you. But I'm going to stop here because I want people to come and listen to you live at the summit. I know this is going to be a riveting session, and I'm so excited that you have agreed to be our closing keynote speaker on Wednesday. So, folks, you need to get your reservations in. You need to get your registration in for the summit, your reservations in the hotel and your flights. Come in on Sunday. We're going to start with a pickleball tournament on Sunday afternoon, have some fun, some networking. We've got full days, Monday, Tuesday. But you need to be there on Wednesday in order to hear John. So, John, thank you so much for the preview. You're absolutely riveting to listen to. I've enjoyed every second of this.
Well, thank you for this podcast interview here, Dawn, and thank you again for inviting me to deliver the keynote presentation at your upcoming event. I'm very much looking forward to working with you and to meeting so many of your attendees and answering their questions on stage or off stage when we're done. But these are critical issues for everyone to ponder, to consider, and to incorporate into their planning portfolio. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. So, folks, this is John Setalides, and he is our closing keynote at our upcoming summit. So make sure that you get your reservations in, get your registration in for the event, and make sure that you attend the session. It's going to be riveting. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Want to nominate yourself or someone else for an interview? Email us at podcast@sig.org.